Good afternoon. We'll try and get things back on track a little closer to the end of the day. We know we stand between you and the cocktail hour, so with our phones on stun, I think we'll just go ahead and start. In case anybody filters in, we'll let them catch up. Good afternoon. Welcome to Protecting Data in the Era of Hacks and Leaks. I'm Polly Pickering. I'm Managing Director of eShore, and have been working in IT solutions and security for about 20 years. Before that, I was an automotive engineer, so I can also help you change your oil if you like. So, anyhow, this afternoon, Ruth and Chase and I have had a lot of time to get together and hopefully bring you a thoughtful presentation that will lead to some good questions at the end, we're hoping. So we've only got 6 things we're going to cover. I'll let you read them up on the screen. We're hoping that, again, we can get back on time, and we want to leave it mostly open to the questions and answers at the end. So the big thing, we're not going to talk a lot about the Panama Papers, because hopefully the session tomorrow afternoon is going to be more detail of that. But we all know it's out there. It's 20 times bigger than WikiLeaks. There's 11.5 million documents that are out, will be available on May 9th. There's only 149 documents that have been released so far, and publicly incriminating evidence is still surfacing. Just wait for what's coming next is sort of the message that we hear. I just pulled this up last night. This is the offshore jurisdictions that are currently listed in the 149 documents that are out there now. But again, on May 9th, we're going to see a lot more. Everybody, I think, knows some of the notable politicians who've been implicated are a couple presidents in Iceland, United Arab Emirates, late father of the British Prime Minister. We've got a Russian president, a Ukrainian president, Argentinian president, the Spanish royal family, a Saudi king. So it's just going to be overwhelming, the amount of information that's going to come out of the Panama Papers. Now, the big question I think a lot of people are asking, and I hope we can do a good job of answering it, is how did they get in? And was it obvious? Sadly, yes. There's a few things that I came to the conference thinking I knew about the Panama Papers until I ran into some of my secret spies here at Offshore Alert who set the record straight and told me that they believe there may have been some inside involvement. So when you think about it, you think 2.6 terabytes of data. That's a lot of data. And people say, how could they let 2.6 terabytes of data just flow out of a business? Somebody must have noticed. And when you look at this breach, the fact that all this stuff was sitting on one server and it was violated through a web app, and a web app that, quite honestly, I wouldn't let the average McDonald's retailer use if they had anything secure they wanted to protect. And when you think about that, because 2.6 terabytes of data was used through their internet connection or their bandwidth, if they weren't paying attention to only having one server, or they put all these confidential documents up on a web app, unencrypted yet, so people's passports, all kinds of personal information was coming through a web server that had a known vulnerability, which they believe is zeroed in as a WordPress plugin called Revolution Slider. And the WordFence, who's a WordPress security company, said that the Mossack website was using an outdated version of the plugin that has known vulnerabilities and would then allow people to upload files and scripts into the site server. The portal server, or the web app, was also supported SSL version 2, an obsolete communication that's extremely susceptible to drone attacks. And Chase will talk more about what's out there in the global threats and the technology behind it. But basically, at the end of the day, the other thing is they had a 3-year-old out-of-date Drupal version, back-end version of the framework on the WordPress app or site that they were using. And their Microsoft Outlook login hadn't been updated since 2009. So that's just where Ruth will talk about just pure neglect. So that's where they think the breaches had happened. Technically, I'm going to kind of go with the spies and friends here who think there might have been some inside involvement too. And I think the rumor is a disgruntled girlfriend of a partner there. So I'll leave that to you guys to talk to amongst yourselves at the cocktail hour. I'll point out some of the people who've handed me that rumor. So anyhow, what I wanted to do, because Chase is our PhD fellow who's going to talk about the deep technology, but the area that I'm mostly involved in, sorry about that, the area I'm mostly involved in is email and email security. And RUTH company is one of our clients, and I'm very happy to say. But the scary part is 91 to 95% of all incidents start with a phishing attack. And if anybody in the room doesn't know about phishing and whaling and spear phishing, and just think about bait and what they're doing. These bad guys are out there basically building a trusted relationship and sending information in various forms that lead people to get confidential information, whether it's credit cards, passwords, you name it. And now whaling, which is the next level of this scary stuff, is going after the CX level, all the CEOs, CFOs. And very cleverly, what these whaling attacks are doing is building up this trusted relationship through a lot of research. They really find out who these people are, what makes them tick. And one of the things we were talking about is I wonder at this conference how many people here have told other folks on LinkedIn or what have you that they're at this conference. And so it'd be interesting to see out of the 250 people at the conference if anybody gets an email that says, hey, when you get back to the hotel, would you mind just sending me over so-and-so's information? I need to send a wire. And they'll build up that little bit of a trust. And it just would be interesting to see if, because we're all here and people know we're here, that's when these guys are taking advantage of publicly available information on sources like LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and they're using it against us. But interesting enough, 70% of all the attacks out there are actually leading to a secondary target, meaning you're just the stepping stone or the pivot. They may not actually be after you. And the good example of that is the Target case, where it was actually their HVAC, their heating and ventilation provider, their supplier, who actually got the hack. And that's how they got in. So the HVAC company was exposed, breached, hacked, and that led into then Target. So a good portion of these attacks are not actually, as egotistical as we like to think, they're not actually after you, they're after your contacts. And back to the social engineering side, I think one of the things that we're going to talk a little bit about is how to mitigate some of the risks and not get things out in the public domain as much. One last thing on how these whaling attacks are now getting more and more progressive is they're really taking the time to get to the CEO through whether it's malware or ransomware. But when they do actually find the vulnerabilities, 50% of the time the attacks will happen a second time. So I don't know if that's going to be the case in Panama Papers, what will be left, but 50% of people who've been attacked will be attacked twice. So it's not something that when you think you're over, they're going to move on to the next guy. Chances are they'll be back. And what this is all meaning, and Ruth's going to talk more about the consequences, is the phishing and whaling attacks are on the rise. There was $1.2 billion worth of losses reported last year from phishing and whaling, and the increase is up 800 million in just the last 6 months in known attacks. Now this is where a lot of people won't even tell people their companies that they've been phished or part of a ransomware because they're afraid of the reputational hit. So this is only what we know has been reported on. And we do know that the money has been traced in these cases where people have been caught to over 108 countries. And with that, I'm going to pass on to Ruth to chat a little bit about some of the fallout of our Panama Papers, and then we'll carry on a bit.
Okay, I think I'll stay seated and be casual. I'll introduce myself first. You have a bit of my background. I'm a partner at Bennett Jones. I'm a lawyer. I've practiced for over 17 years in the field of asset recovery, fraud investigations, related litigation. And with the evolution of technology, there is a new face of fraud. And what we're seeing is that increasingly financial crime has a cybersecurity breach element to it. And that personal data is becoming a commodity that fraudsters can convert into cash. And so I think those who practice in the fraud area, cybersecurity is becoming increasingly relevant. And it's, from different perspectives. So we advise corporations on what they need to do to, from a legal standpoint, to prevent breaches and what they need to do to respond. We also act for people who call them self-help litigants who may come to us. They've hacked in and obtained data that's useful to their case, and then we have to deal with the inevitable issue before the courts of, can we use this data? Is it inappropriate for the court to let it in? And in a fraud investigation, when someone comes to me and they've hacked into and got some data that helps them prove the fraud and prove the identity of the fraudster, obviously we want to include it. And so we fight to include it. And but there's an ongoing sort of discourse in the courts about whether this type of evidence should be admitted or not. And we look at the Panama Papers is an interesting starting point because it's current. It's I think the example of cybersecurity breach, or at least a leak, that is front and center right now. And there's been a significant reaction around the world. And I think it's, when you look at the fallout, it's quite fascinating, because here's this information that we think was obtained through a hack. Maybe it was a leak. In any event, it was obtained illegally. And the reaction has been to use this information. So people around the world are taking hold of this information and making use of it. So we have the Panama police went in and raided the firm to see what else they could find. Now, clearly, without the release of that information, they weren't going in. They didn't have a basis, I assume, to raid the firm, because they hadn't yet. We have criminal inquiries into 200 of the U.S. citizens who had ties to the firm. U.S. Congress demanding investigation as to whether the U.S. banks had ties to the firm. The foreign banks operating in New York have been ordered by the Department of Financial Services to turn over details of their dealings with the firm. And senior tax officials from around the world meeting to discuss proposals for a joint investigation. And, and then as Polly mentioned, we have people resigning, with Prime Minister of Iceland resigning. So there has been an incredible fallout from this. And I think that we're going to see more of it, because on May 9th, ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, is going to release a searchable database of 200,000 documents. So we're going to see the civil litigants from from a fraud, asset, and recovery side. People are going to be searching that database to see if there's anything useful to them. And I think the significance of the Panama Papers and the fallout is it highlights a new and emerging form of a cybersecurity issue, which is the vigilante hacker. It's this purportedly do-gooder hacker who's put the information out into the public domain. And what's interesting is that people are using it. Now, contrast that with, could the police hack into someone's data and use the information to prosecute or launch an inquiry? Typically, no. In almost all cases, courts are going to say, no, state agents cannot obtain evidence illegally and use it for purposes of prosecution or investigation. On the civil side, as I said, there's these self-help litigants, and in Canada at least, the courts have really frowned on litigants taking self-help measures, so hacking into someone's data and using it. However, there are examples where the courts will let it in. But this is a whole new realm. So it's somebody else puts it out into the public domain, and it becomes fair game. But it's quite a contrast to what would occur without this vigilante hacker putting it out into the public domain. And it raises interesting issues and questions about how far this is going to go and whether it's going to promote further examples of vigilante hacking. I think, I'm just going to see. Yeah. One of the points that we're going to talk about is, and Polly and I have talked about these points just prior to sitting down here today, this offshore, onshore, and whether there's really, if there is a difference between, it really gets a bit into the privacy realm, but is there a difference between offshore and onshore privacy protection. And when we sat down, I said, well, what I've just told you. So in Canada and the US, generally speaking, if a state agent wants to obtain personal data, typically they need a warrant. There are examples of where a subpoena would be sufficient, but those are being increasingly narrowed. In the civil context, if you want to obtain any evidence in the hands of a third party, including personal data, you typically have to persuade a court and meet a very high threshold that there's a strong prima facie case of fraud to get that information. I'll let Polly comment if there's a difference on the offshore scenario.
Yeah, and I think this has been something that's been bantered around a lot. You know, we know about the Patriot Act and FISA orders, and one of the things about offshore versus onshore is people are looking at how many boundaries really still exist. You know, is there data sovereignty? Because you may be in Brazil and told you're not going to let this information, depending on who you are as a licensed entity, leave your country. But as soon as you're using Skype, or as soon as you use a Salesforce CRM, or as soon as you start using a web-based version of a Swift tool, all of a sudden you're in the cloud. You know, there really is no way to contain unless there's an absolute mandate that people will not be allowed to use certain clouds or private clouds versus public clouds. And in the offshore world where I've been working for better part of 20 years, you know, there are some legislations in various countries that are actually written against data phishing expeditions, not phishing again, but disclosure and discovery, whereas the data processors are actually considered criminally bound by the law not to hand over information. They are data processors, and the laws are stated that data controllers are the only ones who can then answer to, say, the Attorney General's order or someone. So depending on where, not just the physical security like Chase's data centers, but the legal framework in the various jurisdictions are very different. You know, in Australia, they have their Financial Services Commission have outlines and guidance notes around what they consider, you know, good provisioning of certain cloud services and certain guidelines that they want their licensees to be held to. In Jersey and the Channel Islands, again, it's a place where while we can have an Attorney General come forward with an order to say, yes, this entity must disclose information, it's very important to distinguish that information is only when it's in a usable format. And data that's encrypted is not information. And even if we could break the law and hand over data, it's going to be zeros and ones and gibberish, and without the encryption, decryption, it's useless. And therefore, again, back to the controller and who the beneficial owner is, they must hand over the decryption keys that are probably sitting back on their single pane of glass web login, because the data processors do not have that access. So onshore versus offshore, where people go, the legal framework that's built into the legislation in various jurisdictions is also going to be one of the next hills that I think people are going to conquer.
So and we're moving on to sort of global threats, and I think it's useful to, and a lot of us know about these examples, but it's fascinating, I think, to look at the attacks on very sophisticated companies. I call them sophisticated because you think they're going to have what you would hope they have to protect your personal data, and I think Chase is going to have some comments on that. But when you look at a company, and this is just in the past couple of years, these are just a few examples of the very high-profile attacks. So you have the attack on Target, and we're looking at personal financial information of between 70 and 110 million customers. There's a lot of attacks on healthcare providers. There's the Blue Cross, where they had the personal health data of more than 10 million people, and that's names, birthdays, social security numbers, member identification, significant information. And you'd think of all sort of institutions, the healthcare providers would have what they need to prevent these sort of attacks. But it's not uncommon. You have the Home Depot attack, where there's over 53 million email addresses and credit card numbers. The Sony Pictures hack, which was sort of I guess, well known because it led to the cancellation of the release of what I thought was a very funny movie, The Interview. But it was very embarrassing for Sony, of course, because they gained access to some sensitive emails that was sort of controversial, and they obtained employee data and led to a settlement. In 2015 is the Ashley Madison, so that's the infidelity website, which privacy was obviously of utmost concern to those members of the website, and there was a leak of over information for 39 million members. And then you have the U.S. government being hacked, so the Office of Personnel Management, where you have information of federal civil servants being hacked. You have the attack on the FBI, and the attacks on the law firms are increasingly common. We don't always read about them because people don't report them. Because what's happening is sometimes the managing partner of a law firm will just, on their screen, what will pop up is, we have hold of all your data. If you do not pay this ransom through Bitcoin with the following payment details, we will destroy all your data, and do not bother calling the police or doing anything. And people apparently are paying and not reporting it. And it's quite hushed because no one wants to really admit that they've been hacked, and they'd rather just deal with it. But it's, I think what we should have Chase, well, after you introduce yourself, Chase, tell us about what your thoughts are on whether these organizations were compliant and whether that's relevant.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Chase Cunningham. I'm the Director of Cyber Threat Research for Armor. I've worked for the NSA for about 14, 15 years. Got comic books now that I publish to try and help kids learn about cybersecurity. So if you have little ones, please go check it out because we love to get feedback from parents. I'll give you details if you're interested afterwards. But I just talk about the technology side of things because honestly, I've spent most of my life trying not to get caught by the cops doing this type of operation. So the legal side is not something I even want to touch. I'm very glad to have these two up here. But for me, I look at things from the bad guy perspective, right? I actively am engaged with law enforcement, with Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Interpol, some of those folks. I'm on a few task forces that have been involved in a variety of different operations. And we really look at things from how the bad guys look at your environment. Honestly, we are not looking at it from the defense side. We look at it from the nasty underground side of the internet. You probably heard about the darknet and Tor and things like that. My team and myself, that's where we reside, is that sort of nether region between where we probably shouldn't be and what we're allowed to get away with because we're trying to do things for people on the right side of the law. But target rich, yeah, 99% of your endpoints are vulnerable to a package exploit kit. Everybody in this room right now has probably got a phone with them. For those of you using iPhones, those are great. If you're using Samsung, assets like that, even if they were given to you by your company, these are one of my favorite ways to get access to a corporate network because it's got plenty of stuff on it. It usually connects via Wi-Fi. They don't really push patches too often to that. If you're using a Samsung device, which has Android on there, the last survey they did on applications running in the Android store, 60% of them had malware embedded in it. So for one for every 3 apps that you download in Galaxy is going to have a piece of malware in it. So congratulations, let me have access to your corporate network. Wi-Fi is great too. If you think about endpoint vulnerability with Wi-Fi, anybody in here got an HP printer in your office that you bought before 2014? By default, those were all enabled with full Wi-Fi capability. It's turned on from the moment you plug it in. My favorite way to get access to a network is through a wirelessly enabled printer, because guess what? You print stuff from file shares on that printer. Gives me access to your entire corporate network over a printer. Nobody ever thinks about locking down a printer because printers print. So, other things that you've got access to, every time you take your corporate laptop home, you let little Tommy or Timmy or Billy or whoever else jump on your computer. Little Tommy, Timmy, or Billy goes off to a website that they shouldn't, playing Minecraft or whatever else. They download something they shouldn't. They've infected your corporate machine, which is your personal machine. Now that tunnels its way to your corporate environment, and we get access through that application. So very hard to manage those endpoints. Talking about employees, almost 60% of those folks put stuff that's company intellectual property into cloud drives. Anybody in here not using Box or Google Drive or Dropbox or something like that, odds are sometime during the, while you've been at work, you've put some stuff on a Google Drive that probably had work information in it. What's the odds that somebody could access your Google Drive and get corporate information simply because you posted into a Dropbox or Box or Google Drive, right? works all the time. And then if you're looking at phishing, which Polly broke down for us, 91% is the click-through rate. If you got 100 people in your office and I send an email, a very well-crafted, targeted email to 100 people, I'm going to get at least 9 of them that'll click on my piece of malware, and I get access to your network through that. So it's a numbers game. Very hard for the security folks to manage it. Unfortunately, a lot of people think they've got, Rick, the IT guy, that's going to be your security ninja. Rick is not a security ninja unless he grew up in the security world, the NSAs, the government agencies, the FBIs, the places like that. That's where you learn to do hardcore security operations. No matter how hard he tries, he's not been trained to act like a bad guy, so he won't know how the bad guys get access, and that's how Rick loses the battle on the cyber front. Next piece. Unfortunately, it gets even worse, right? I'm always the harbinger of doom, and every time I speak in somewhere, it's usually when I get done, it's really quiet, and I have drinks by myself because no one wants to talk to me. But, really, if you're looking at last year, right, last year was the year of 1 billion records stolen. It used to be that guys had to actually hack into environments to get data. Now you don't anymore. You just go buy it on the underground, like she was talking about with OPM, with Target, with name the company. All those records have been stolen. Probably 40% of the time, they just steal the records and post them on the underground, and they're just there. I don't actually even have to go after you on a profile, on a Facebook, on a LinkedIn, or whatever else. I can just go buy your record on the underground for about 15 bucks, and then I have your entire portfolio there that I can use to go after you. Medical records go for a little bit more, and they're using those right now to go after, like she was talking about with whaling, go after CEOs, CFOs, folks like that, because if you're a CEO, CXO, and I've got your medical record that tells me you're taking some medication or have had a medical procedure done that you don't want the world to know about, if I send you an email and say, I'm going to tell everybody about this and screenshot it, unless you give me access to your corporate network, what are you going to do? Blackmail works. It's worked from, days ago. It works from days past. It'll continue to work. If you're looking at how long it actually takes to patch a vulnerability right now, the best that you get is about 6 months. So from the moment that somebody comes out and says, there is a problem with this piece of software, the best that you get is usually about 6 months before it's actually patched, written across the network, right? She was talking about there was a server from Panama that was 2009, I think. The longest that I've ever personally seen an unpatched system out there talking to the internet is 13 years. 13 years, unpatched system, corporate network, talking wide open to the internet. So think about all the endpoints that you have at your company, all the employees you have, all the stuff that they do with all that, all the software that they're running, right? See how the numbers keep stacking up here? And then you got 6 months of playtime for bad guys to get after exploits because they're not even patched. And that's if you're doing it really, really well. So this is why I always have drinks by myself afterwards. And then if you're talking about how much bad stuff costs on the underground, it's cheap because there's so much of it. It's literally a bulk market. If I've got $5,000 and I want to go after a company, I can go buy $5,000 worth of records on the underground. Odds are, out of $5,000 worth of records, I'm going to find a valid account to get access to an environment. It works. It just simply works. And it really, I like to give, you've probably heard a lot of this stuff in the media. If you've watched any of those terrible hacker movies that are out there, that's not how it really works. Hugh Jackman is really good looking. Unfortunately, most of the bad guys look like me. So that's not how it works, right? I love those movies because they're great comedies for folks that do what I do. But recon, you're looking at about 3 hours worth of work to actually figure out what assets, what pieces we want to go after. Mapping network assets, a couple more hours. I'm actually going to figure out my target selection. It's going to take, maybe an hour or so. 6 to 8 hours, the longest part of this whole thing is going to be crafting an exploit to get access to that system. Unless I'm really lazy or I've got money and I just go buy the exploit, like you were talking about with Drupal and WordPress. WordPress and Drupal, love them because they have access to a lot of things that they shouldn't. And I can buy an exploit for $50 on the underground and guaranteed I'm going to get access. Exploit it. It actually takes longer for me to get a call back on the machine depending on my internet speed than it does to drop a shell on a box. Then I'm going to stay in there for about 30 minutes, half hour, figure out where I want to go, move around the network, and I'm going to make sure that I have access to come back to that network later because odds are if you do happen to pick up that we're in your environment, you'll kill us from that particular access point, but we're going to set up 3 or 4 or 5 access points, right? Because we want to come back. We will continue to access that environment because we're selling that information. If we're bad guys, that's what we're doing. We're taking that data and we're selling it. we're actually leveraging access. Polly was talking about a lot of times we're not even after you, we're using you to go after someone else. So that's where we actually get the biggest return on our investment, is selling your access to somebody else so that they can leverage it. And then, less than 4 hours to get the data out. Just depends on how long we can stay. If you're thinking about what we just talked about with average of 6 months worth of time for me to actually be in there and play, if I can do 4 hours a day over 6 months, I can get a whole lot of data. It just, mathematically, it all works, right? Next slide, please. I like to show these because there's always so much hype and so much snake oil sort of bossed around the media, but these are actual samples from activities that I've done. I can't go into specifics on them, but there's the data. I love where it shows login and admin, username, password. And folks, this was not like me going off with some crazy Hugh Jackman types hack. This was literally me knowing what commands to enter into Google to get Google to send me back these results. That's how hard this stuff is. You don't have to be Johnny Ninja hacker to do this. If you just know what you're doing and know where to poke, you can find this type of access. Next slide. And if you're really, really lazy and you really don't want to, even bother typing into Google, you can go pay for it. There it is right there. That's me chatting with a guy in Russia on the right. He's providing me tech support on his GUI-based hacking system, which is on the left, that says, it literally has a button that says hack. It's that awesome, right? And when it doesn't work, I'm on live chat with this guy in Russia, and he says, well, what's the problem? Well, it didn't send me back my shell, and I can't get access. Hang on a minute. He goes back and fixes things, sends me a patch, pushes. We run the hack button again, and I'll jump in there. Pretty awesome. It cost $5,000, I think, for this particular UI access tool. And it goes after WordPress and Drupal. Fun. Next slide. And all that data that you're talking about that people have said is stolen and whatever else, people have this sort of nebulous concept of what that data actually is. Well, there it is. So there's guys called Rex Mundi that are stealing stuff, and they don't even bother selling it. They just say, here it is. You want it, come get it. You'll see Rex Mundi telling people that are customers of Domino's in France that if Domino's doesn't play ball with us, you have X number of hours, we're going to dump your entire customer database online. Then you see the OPM, the Social Security Administration right there. And then where it says dark code, I love that one because I was unfortunately on the task, helping with the task force that took action to take down dark code. And we said, yes, we got them. They'll never come back. We smashed dark code. There's the website 25 days later when they were back up online and cooking, and basically it's whack-a-mole. Next slide. So I love to show this because this is kind of my definition of like terror. But really, when you're thinking about this, your sense of security hopefully is a little bit skewed here. Honestly, that's good because I'm trying to wake people up to this concept that cyber is as bad as we say it is. This is the reality around it. I think. Yeah. So the good news is that if you can, there's folks like myself that are out there that are actually involved in these operations that are doing the right sort of cyber activities, but we look at it from the bad guys side of things, not from just the defense piece. This is an operation that I was involved in where a guy went after a system, had major accesses, was doing all kinds of bad stuff. We did a little bit of post-reconnaissance and reverse intelligence work, and we're actually able to figure out the pseudonym that he was using, where he was hosting things, what type of activities he was running from there. And on the next one, if you click the next one, on the next one, because we know how to do what we're doing on the bad guy's side, we flipped the table and we're actually able to go look at his website where he was hosting things and had a webcam up that was unpatched. We took a picture inside of his office from his webcam and gave it to the FBI. So you can turn these tables on their head if you know how to do it and do it correctly. And unfortunately for this individual, he wound up wearing an orange jumpsuit and some shiny bracelets for the next 10 years. But this is the activity that you can do, and this is why we're trying to get different people into the right sort of places to go after these individuals. So that's back to you guys.
Yeah, so we're going to try and take you down off the ceiling here now just a little bit and give you a little bit of ray of sunshine, which is there is some enlightenment here. There is some layers to get to. And when we talk about how we can protect things, we don't want to call up the 90s and say, hi, we're back and we need your old security strategy because that was working. Unfortunately, we just can't seem to keep up. So when we look at where we're at, there's three things that we're thinking might be able to help you out in regards to where this is all going. One, obviously technology. So we can use the technology to fight the technology. However, the technology you have today, and I say you because all of us are in this boat, is probably not good enough. While you may have endpoint security, while you may have some encryption employed, chances are you may not, like Chase said, you've got 6 months of vulnerabilities, and these are coming out all the time. So unfortunately, you have to add some additional technology to what you're doing. The second thing, which is a lot easier to hopefully deal with and a lot less expensive, is the human firewall. We have to look at this and realize that this is, if you can actually train the people to know what to look for, not to click on those pretty little blue links that say there's a Cayman Airways flight sale to Panama, just if you can try and educate your users and your children to please stay off some of these websites, that's probably the easiest place that we can start with on fixing some of the issues that we have. And the main thing there when we talk about human firewall training is you have to get one thing straight with your employees, your family, anybody who you want to be part of this change this for the good, is you have to remove the implied trust. The problem is people have had this false sense of security that it's come in on an email or I'm on a website, and people just have a certain level of trust. So that's sort of the layer 2, is getting down to the human layer. Oops. Sorry. And I was just going to say the third layer, which isn't up here, is to create a herd alertness. So if we can join together and share cooperative, positive information, that is where you're going to find that there's actually some hope, some light at the end of the tunnel. And with that, I'm going to move back to Ruth to talk about some of the scope of some of our breaches.
So as I said at the outset, I've been practicing in the area of fraud, and traditionally we have victims of fraud come to us and say, we've lost all our money, can you trace it? And that's what, traditionally fraud lawyers and asset recovery lawyers do. We trace the money, we find the bad guys, we go after third parties who may have been complicit or assisted in the fraud. But now, as I said, there's sort of a new aspect of fraud where companies are coming to us and saying, okay, we've been breached. So it's not our data has been stolen, not always the money, but we need you to help us avoid further costs. So the new aspect of fraud is where companies need to react to a data breach, and it's important that they do so appropriately, and not just, well, there's 2 points. It's important that they take steps to prevent the data breach and then react to it appropriately, because the scope of liability to a company that fails to do either or both is massive. And so from my perspective, as a lawyer, as a litigator, we look at the scope of liability and give advice to that. And we're seeing as the data breaches increase in growth and size, the liability is expanding. So from the regulatory front, there's can be significant liability. In the U.S., the Federal Trade Commission has imposed substantial fines up to about $22 million for just the event of a breach. And the way they do that, so the Federal Trade Commission, they look at the promises that these companies make on their website. So typically a website will have a promise to its customers that it will protect personal data, or will take all reasonable steps to safeguard personal data. And the Federal Trade Commission has gone in and said, well, that's really false and misleading, and we're going to fine you for that. And so at least in the U.S., there have been substantial fines for just failing to take preventive steps. In Canada, at least, we're not there yet. We have new legislation that if you fail to notify once you are aware of a breach, there will be a $100,000 fine. Whether that will mean $100,000 per record hasn't been determined yet. But if it is, so if you have 10 million people's records are obtained through a data breach and you fail to notify, it remains an open issue as to whether that's going to be $100,000 times the 10 million or whether it's going to be a net amount. But the main point is that as these corporate victims of fraud, that is the cybersecurity, get hit, they're facing significant regulatory fines for either failing to take all reasonable steps to prevent it or failing to respond. We have the shareholder claims. So talked about the Target data breach, and in that case, the shareholders have started litigation against the directors and officers for failing to maintain the proper internal controls or to take adequate steps to respond after the attack. And so we're seeing that directors and officers of companies have significant exposure from either the data breach itself or the failure to respond. And we haven't had any of the shareholder claim litigation in Canada, but I don't think we're far off from that. And we haven't seen how the Target one has unfolded. The victim claims, so those individuals whose data has been breached, have a basis to claim. And in Canada, in Ontario, our Court of Appeal has said that just for having your data breached, you may be entitled to up to $20,000. So you don't have to show damages, just that the fact of the breach will be enough possibly to get you up to $20,000. But you have to think about 20,000 times 10 million people whose data has been breached. So again, for these corporate victims of cybersecurity, their exposure is significant if they don't take all necessary steps. Now it's interesting because Chase and I were talking before about, taking all reasonable steps is very different from taking all required steps to protect yourself, because a company may get off in terms of liability from this level of exposure. That has nothing to do with whether they've done what they need to do. It just, they may meet the requirements of having done what they should do. So while they may avoid some of the claims in litigation, they won't avoid the breach, and they won't avoid the loss of reputation that goes along with it. And Chase, maybe you can just talk a bit about those standards.
Yeah, so with with compliance, and I'm by no means a compliance wizard, but I've been on plenty of red team events and plenty of pen tests where we've owned fully compliant environments. People right now are sort of using it as a checkbox, right? I have PCI or payment card data, I have healthcare data, I have whatever data, I meet compliance requirement X, I've checked the box, life is good, and we shall continue forward and move on, and et cetera, et cetera. When in reality, a lot of times they'll game the system for those pen tests and for those compliance needs. If you're going to go in and do a pen test on an environment that's going to meet a particular standard, they'll give you a range of IPs to go after. In reality, those are like a minimum set of IPs and IP addresses, that is. And they'll let you hack away at them all day long because they know that those are bulletproof and you won't get any access and they can check the box. But in reality, everything else in their environment doesn't meet that standard. And the moment that you move on, they get hit a week later with their fully compliant environment. So a lot of these compliant sort of activities can be gamed to where, yes, you are compliant in Dominus Patria Filii Sancti, thank you very much, you're compliant. In reality, you haven't actually done anything to make sure that you are protected from the threats as they exist. It's kind of like having a castle with a really big wall, and you put it up there, but you didn't actually make it out of any stone. It's styrofoam that's painted to look like stone. But yes, you have a wall, right? That will stop someone.
And I think before we open it up for questions, I just have one question for the audience, which is just a raise of hands. How many folks in here actually have cybersecurity attacks fail back in part of their business continuity plan? So we can protect against hurricanes, we got the lightning bolts gun, but the cybersecurity, we do or don't know if that's part of our actual continuity plan. Oh, we got a hand. All right. Excellent. All right. Well, that was my one question for the audience. So questions from you guys, for any of us?
So I should get rid of my Android operating system before I start.
Well, unfortunately, you have to use these things now, right? Because it's part of your daily life. However, my Chase Cunningham's 2 cents is, if you don't really need it, then don't use it. And if you can't,
in terms of downloading the app.
yeah. So if you're going to download an app on iPhone, the reason that I use iPhone is because I'm getting ready to publish an app for families and kids in iPhone, and I know how big of a pain in the ass it is to put apps into Apple Store and Google and Samsung and those stores. If you wake up tomorrow and you decide you got an app that you want to publish, you can publish it and stick it in there. And technically, when I'm saying malware, doesn't necessarily mean that it's doing anything malicious, but it's possible that it's doing something outside the bounds of what you would consider that app to be doing. So if you don't need it, kind of don't use it. That's my 2 cents.
And after those people click on those URLs or they get phished, one of the things I didn't mention is those threats sit on an average of 205 days before they're exploited. So, you know, you could be putting in a great new cybersecurity policy tomorrow, but unfortunately, about 199 days ago, you didn't.
So what's your view on, sorry, that's not a question. On the cloud services like Dropbox and Skype? You alluded to everybody using those.
Yeah.
But you didn't actually say, okay, they're okay, they're not okay.
So
What should, we still don't know what we should do.
So, well, I work for a cloud hosting company, so I'm going to tell you, come talk to me, right? I'll hook you up. But the reality of it is, everybody in here is going to have to use this stuff because it makes life better, and that's what technology is for, right? But the corporate piece, the problem that's there is that you're sticking stuff on an asset which is not really controlled by your company, right? You're doing work, you think oh crap, I'm going to need this later when I get home. I'll stick it on my Google Drive when I get home, blah, 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 whatever else. What's the likelihood that somebody's got your Gmail username and password, gets in there, finds that company asset, and takes it? Now, they would have to speak about the liability piece, but I can tell you from personal experience, it is stupid easy for me to go get 100,000 valid accounts on Gmail to try out and go after a particular resource. And if I happen to do my recon and know that you're working on something that I think could be really interesting to sell on the underground, I'll try all day long to get access to your Google Drive. My advice to companies is, if you're going to allow your employees to be empowered to use those type of services, you need to set up very simple things. Like, did you know that Gmail and Google Drive have 2-factor authentication? Have you set that up? Most people will say, A, I didn't know what that is, and B, no, I haven't set it up. Well, doing that one thing right there just nullified 95% of the problem that you would have with somebody hacking into your Google Drive. And it takes you 6 minutes to set it up. And by doing that, it's great. And I was talking with Ruth and Polly earlier, like, in cybersecurity, I jokingly say that this is a zombie marathon. You don't have to outrun every zombie, you just got to outrun the guy next to you. You know, as long as you do something better than him, they'll go get him, and you're still trucking right along. If you can do 1 or 2 things better than that guy, you know, unfortunately, it's not one of those things where I'll drag you and pull you up by your hand. I'm gonna, watch you sink as I keep moving. And if you really need secure cloud, please come talk to me, because I can help you set that up, and that's what we do. We're bulletproof, but it's a whole nother layer. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I found it quite interesting, especially coming from a small offshore jurisdiction where I imagine that many of the law firms would not have this sort of security, the necessary security to protect their files. It seems from listening to the presentation that data hacks are more detrimental to the offshore sector than all these disclosure initiatives from the various onshore jurisdictions like the FATCO and the CRS and the Canada Tax Informant Program, etc. What do you think the future with respect to the small offshore jurisdiction? What do you think the
I don't even know
future?
what those acronyms are.
Oh, sorry.
Well,
Technology guy, like.
Right.
and when you say, for the small nation, I'm from the Cayman Islands, and I can tell you that I work with 600 companies. I don't work with any companies in North America. I only work with the offshore, and I have 600 clients who are in the offshore jurisdiction who are hosting data in secure clouds, private or multi-tenanted private clouds, or running email through our systems for security. So being small doesn't necessarily have anything really to do with it. The point is, and they're mostly law firms, banks, financial service regulated entities that I work with. And that's 600 out of the 15,000 clients that we work with globally. The RUTH is with our other North American data center. But I think the question for you is, what's next? The thing is, for me, and this is Ruth and I talked about this needs to become a boardroom discussion, because ignorance is no longer defense. Going to, like Chase said, saying, oh, don't worry, I got it covered, Rick's taking care of it for me. Rick is not the one who's going to end up in these lawsuits with Ruth here, on one side of the table with you. So I think that's the future. The future is nobody has to become PhD Chase level, CISSP, and all the alphabet soup after their name, but they do have to realize that there's some very simple things that can be done, and you can't outsource that decision making. That has to happen at the board level. That's the future. Just where we were with disaster recovery and continuity 10 years ago, and we all thought, why do we need a second copy of everything? Well, I think that's where we are going to see in 10 years from now. Cybersecurity is going to be part of every business continuity plan, and hopefully more in every boardroom agenda meeting going forward. Want to add to that? Ruth?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. So I agree with Polly. I mean, when you look at the case law evolving, it's clear that directors and officers of companies or managing partners of firms have to pay attention to cybersecurity. Otherwise, there is the exposure. And so you ask someone like Chase, I think he'll say, you need a third-party service provider. You're going to outsource it, and I would agree with that. But I think it's also, you just can't delegate it. So from the liability perspective, what people they have to pay attention to it, on the director level. But it can't just be, well, I paid attention to it. I just hired some guy who has a firm or some service provider, and I've subcontracted this out. That's not going to be good enough. I think the directors, officers, or managing partners of firm are going to be held to a higher standard with respect to taking the care needed to know that you have secured the data that you are in charge of.
And speaking just on the technology side, right, it doesn't do you any good as a company or a nation or anything to go off and say, we now have a CISO. Congratulations, you hired dude X that's got all these creds and whatever else, and he's your CISO. What we find in the companies that are in organizations that are doing it right is they actually empower that person to make changes and do things the right way, rather than simply say, we have a CISO. Like having some guy or guy, gal, whatever, with a title that is supposed to fix all of your cybersecurity problems does not fix your cybersecurity problems. Those individuals must be empowered. They got to have budget, they got to have directive, and they got to have the CEO's ear to actually go off and get things done. The ones that are doing it wrong are the ones that say, we've got a CISO, and that's from here till the end of days. That's what the CISO does, is he's a figurehead and a talking puppet and whatever else. You can't just hire your way out of the problem. They've got to be able to do something.
And from a regulator standpoint, just real quick, we have to see that there's also onus back on the people who are regulating us. I just got back last week from talking to the central bank in Mauritius, because a lot of the regulations out there are outdated. And they say, well, we've got an outsourcing policy, or we've got a guidance notes on disaster recovery. That's good enough. We're not going to write a cloud provisioning policy, or we're not going to give you additional checklists. We'll tell you when it's not good enough in your next audit. And so, I know in the Cayman Islands, the monetary authority there is looking at instituting soon penetration testing as part of their audit. So the regulators and the government entities also have a responsibility to raise their game and not sit back and not give guidance to the regulated entities on what would be considered best practice. So they can't just wait for somebody else to come in and say to the private sector, well, you guys will figure it out, because obviously it's the reputation of the industry that's at risk as well, and the countries. So.
We haven't really talked about the hacks of big financial systems and personal financial connections to big financial systems. So we've had a few of those. In fact, from the Fed, apparently Bangladesh by the central bank robbed God knows how much. And then we've had major American banks that have been hit by Russian hackers. And finally, there's the problem of you as an individual going in to deal with your own personal finances. You're using internet bill pay, you're doing all that stuff. Is there any protection?
So on the technology side, banking is one of the ones that they've been hit so hard for so long that they're actually doing a really good job now, to be perfectly honest with you. I use USAA for I'm retired military. I use USAA for my banking app. They've done an amazing job of implementing single sign-on and technology in place and whatever, right? Like Chase Bank and JP Morgan and some of those, because they've been in the ring and they've been knocked down, with their jaw sitting outside of their face, they've gotten pretty good at doing the right things. Honestly, from the technology side, if you really want to figure an area to be concerned about, it's healthcare. Your hospitals, your doctors, your dentists, folks like that, your all these other apps and IoT stuff that they're putting into place right now. In healthcare is 10 to 15 years behind the power curve of banking in security, flat out. It may even be further.
And what about the personal finance software, Bridges? Is your point of access to the banking system is different?
That's a really hard one to tackle because honestly, the most of the problem set for that is going to come from you and what you've got going on at your home and whether or not there's something there that, you know, like I say, the little Tommy, Timmy, Billy problem. And I've got 2 rugrats in my house that use my stuff all the time. And unfortunately for them, their dad's a paranoid tech geek, so they have to go through VPNs and whatever else. So find another 5-year-old that knows what VPN is. But you know, it's the problem with your home. The banks have done a really, honestly, a good job, the big banks anyway, of trying to stay as close to the threat as they can. Yes, ma'am, you were saying something?
Yeah, that covers the ATM part, but what about the skip machines,
Yeah.
from the ATMs or gift cards could be used at ATMs?
I mean, essentially, in a couple of seconds, you can get a skimming device installed on an ATM or whatever else. You're probably going to have your credit card and that data, if it hadn't already been taken, it's probably going to get taken at some point in the near future. All you can really do is try and be proactive about it and pay attention to what's going on with your systems and your accounts and take care of your own self. The banks are there and they've done a pretty good job at, you know, at refunding them money and pieces along those lines. You know, it's kind of one of those things too where if you look at something and if it doesn't look right, just don't use it. Yeah, I mean, if you go up to an ATM and 2 weeks ago there wasn't a little green box where you slide your card in, and now there's a little green box where you slide your card in, well, what? Don't use it. Go find another ATM. That's a skimmer. You know, if you go to a gas station and all of a sudden you notice that there's a webcam over the ATM that wasn't there a week ago, don't use it. They're looking at your PIN number. You know, that type of thing. It's in cyber, a lot of time in security ops, a lot of times it doesn't have to be super awesome technical. It's just got to be a little bit of, you know, paying attention to your surroundings and being cognizant of what the threat is, if that makes sense. Yes, sir.
One of the things we did as a board is we sat the directors and looked at cybersecurity point of view, growth policy, but ultimately we trained the staff, we looked at the backup process we're doing, and one of the things we took about insurance, is it worth taking out insurance? Is that something you're doing?
You want to talk about that from that side?
Yeah, I think that is becoming increasingly common, and you're seeing actually a specific cyber insurance policy because your general liability policy may not or cover that incidental. But yeah, I think from a business perspective, it is worthwhile giving serious consideration to because the exposure can be so significant. Now, having said that, we're seeing the fights play out in the courts between the insurance company and the insured about whether this particular incident of cyber attack is insurable, and the fights about whether their systems weren't good enough. Because it's like if you have a house alarm and you don't turn it on and your house gets robbed, your insurance company may say, well, yeah, but you checked that box. It said you had a burglar alarm and you didn't activate it. So we're not going to cover you right now. And you may have the same we are seeing that same kind of fight play out in the courts. So while it's, I think, advisable to seriously consider a specific cyber insurance policy, it has to be matched with the requisite efforts to implement those measures to prevent and respond appropriately if you have any notification that there's been a possible attack.
One of the things we were told was, for instance, here's a good example where everyone's got the same user ID to access the internet here, so everyone's sat there.
Talking about the Wi-Fi? Yeah.
We shouldn't be doing that because it's not public domain and everyone's got access to it. And someone here could be, well, you could be
I might be.
skimming all of our stuff.
I don't make a lot of money. I got to do something. Yeah. I got kids. But no, I mean, so something like Armor, what we do is because we have bulletproof servers, we actually offer insurance when you host stuff with us that covers that because, and we'll tell you flat out, like we're not concerned about the endpoints and we're not concerned about the users on your system. We're protecting the servers and the data. And that's what we're working to get that insurance for. And it's because that's all that we do and we're hardcore security people that we're that good at it. The problem that I have in cyberspace, in cybersecurity right now is a lot of vendors are out there and they'll sell you this awesome solution for a particular cybersecurity problem, but it doesn't really fix the issue. If they're not doing one thing and doing it really, really well, then they're probably selling you a little bit of snake oil on top of some nice UI, to be perfectly honest with you. I mean, the insurance is only as good as what you're insuring, and if it's not hosted, the data itself is not hosted by someone that's going to protect that and take care of it like, that's their livelihood. I mean, it's your livelihood, it's your data. So the insurance policy, may or may not go your way.
Unfortunately, there's not much ROI in protecting yourself, except the fact you'll be in business again. Yeah.
My observation, we don't know with the Mossack Fonseca scenario what precisely did happen, as you say, there were rules about it, but one of the weak links is evidently rogue employees or disgruntled employees, and our IT guy has made the observation, well, you can have as many padlocks on your electronic server or whatever, but the guy who has the staff who are entrusted with the keys are a weak link against which it seems seemingly impossible to protect. I mean, is there any means of safeguarding against that?
I think that Chase and I will both say, I'll say from an email perspective and he'll from a data center's perspective, is that's why those trusted third parties are actually safer than a lot of times having that guy do it yourself, because he can read your email. He knows what you're doing. And if he's disgruntled, a brown paper bag and some cash, he's your weakest link, no doubt about it. So if you lift up those controls, and maybe they can see the metadata, maybe they can do the to, the from, they can run the reports. But if you take away the ability for them to actually have high super level admin rights, then you're mitigating the risk. So your own, not just IT department, but your disgruntled employees, what you want to do is make it so that if they go to do something explosive, you have the right alerts in place and you have the right notification procedures in place, and hopefully have it part of your business continuity, your HR policy, you name it. So the answer is yes, you can do quite a bit in the human side of your business to protect yourself with trusted third parties.
From the technology side, right? So at our company, I'm what you would consider a trusted individual. Whether or not I should be is a whole nother story. But essentially, in order for me to get access to your server, if you hosted it with us, I'm a trusted employee. I'm doing maintenance, right? When I go to a system that only issues me a one-time password to get access to your server. It sets up an L2L connection, so a one-way connection, right? And then every keystroke that I type on that machine as I'm doing my operations is logged and is put in a log that's encrypted away from that particular server. And as long as if I try and do anything outside the bounds of what I'm authorized to do, it kills that connection, sends all that stuff over to a log, and alerts somebody in SecOps that says this guy's doing something he shouldn't do. Now, depending on how much time I was able to spend there, I might be able to do something malicious, but at least there, technically, you have logs, you have accesses, and you have single activity connections that you can actually manage. So you have to have those type of technologies in place in order to take care of that, if that's something that's of value to you. Because ultimately, yes, an individual can do a lot of damage if they have trust in your environment, but there are certain technologies and certain approaches that you can leverage to minimize that from being any further nasty than it could be.
I mean, the Mossack Fonseca thing was part of what is extraordinary is the volume of documents clearly that were copied in some way and presumably destroyed. But, a disgruntled employee can take, on a jump drive, half a dozen scanned documents that may be of a confidential nature, embarrassing to a client, whatever, and distribute those, send them to someone. I mean, is encryption a practical means that can be a bar to that sort of thing, or is it just
I personally, first off, the whole jump drive, if you still have USB ports open on your
Kill it.
machines and stuff, that's rule number one. You can install, I can't install a printer driver on my machine. That's it, and I can only use my USB ports to power a device, charge a phone. But the moment I try and move data around, alert, I'm going to have the Batman guys dropping down on me so fast it's not even funny. So there are simple things you can do that don't cost a lot of money. And yes, so start to look at those things you can do. And from a third-party perspective, we again, 91, 95% of all breaches come from email. So start with that. Start with protecting your email. Start with locking things down. Go with what we all know that can be taken care of. And then get it to the boardroom, get it to the agenda, hire the right people, spend the dosh, and that's probably the only hope.
Well, and I mean, I say I'm a big believer in encryption. If you can encrypt, do. Why not? I mean, it's essentially, and you need to encrypt in rest or at rest and in transit, right? If you just do one or the other, it's only 50% of the problem. You wouldn't hop on an airplane with one wing and expect it to fly, right? Same sort of thing. You got to do 100% of it in rest and at transit. And encryption doesn't have to be hard. It's still back to that zombie marathon thing, right? It just needs to be enough where if somebody got it, it's not worth their time and effort. They're not going to try and decrypt data when they can get it somewhere else from somebody else that's not encrypted.
Most of us who were lawyers, who at one time or another worked with crime investigators, and what's been obvious to anyone who's used them is that a lot of things that are secret to cops or to the rest of the world aren't secret to these guys who seem to be able to get
Oh,
everything.
this is going to be a you question.
Made it and I've seen that kind of stuff, and I'm thinking that all that's happened is the privacy problem has moved up orders of magnitude, but it's essentially the same set of problems.
Well, I mean, I think it goes back to sort of the initial comments. It's similar to the vigilante hacker. So there is this ability to get information and data, and there are a number of examples where the police have used, or Crown attorneys, and state agents have used data that's come about from a hack. And sometimes, there are examples where you really want it. There's an example where some kid in his parents' basement hacked into some people's computers and found evidence that a California judge had child pornography on his computer. It led to charges. So in that scenario, people say, well, yeah, there's an example of where I'm okay with that. I'm okay with this hacked information. But you're right. It's interesting that, the amount of information that some kid in the basement can get was well beyond what sort of the state agents could obtain. Absolutely. Yeah, and if it comes via sort of the third party, you're seeing that in the criminal context, they're often letting it in the civil context too. Really, where the courts have sort of discouraged that is what they call the self-help litigant. So they don't like where the plaintiff himself there's evidence that he is hacked into the defendant's system. But if somehow that plaintiff comes across some information that's helpful, we're seeing it get admitted. So that's what's so interesting about the Panama Papers is that, well, here's information that no one was able to obtain legally to date, and then it gets into the public domain, and then on May 9th, we're all going to have a searchable database to use for our fraud investigations. It's information that we didn't have before that was obtained illegally, but the fact that it was obtained illegally, I don't think is going to keep it out of the courts.
Once any court bestows some kind of credibility on it, the floodgates were open, weren't they? I mean, if any of this material, which was illegally obtained, which is often forgotten, ends up in the courts and relied upon, and it's blessed in that way, there's an incentive to repeat this exercise.
Well, I think that's it. That's the issue with the vigilante hacker. And I know there was an example where there was an attempt to use some of the evidence from WikiLeaks in a court proceeding, and the court had determined that it wasn't reliable. But so I think it stopped there. But I think you're right that if from that searchable database there's an attempt to use it, and the courts give it its blessing and rely on it, and there's some basis to say it's reliable. These seem like authentic, legitimate records. Well, yeah, I think there is creating some form of incentive for the vigilante hacker to go out and continue on.
You got to remember, these bad guys, they go to this job 9 to 5 just like we do. So this is a big industry. This isn't, the one or two people, and it's no longer separated where we think, oh, it was China or it was the Ukraine. I was telling Ruth the other day, Montreal is in the top 5 locations where some of this stuff is being exposed. So it's interesting that this is not something that's just going to go away. These guys get paid good money. And Chase, you mentioned like the guy in India who's making, a few dollars an hour, and he's approached by the bad guys to put a little piece of malware on some of the code he's developing because somebody's now going to pay him an extra $150 an hour to do his job, go to the same place, and just happen to slip a few extra packages into his delivery that he's giving to that law firm that he's coding for, or that, bank. So
Yeah, some of the drug cartels have figured out too that it's a lot cheaper to do cybercrime than it is to do drugs. The cartels in Mexico have actually started recruiting people out of university down there that don't have anything to do, and doing exactly what the Russian cybercrime guys did, and said, look, we'll put you up in an apartment, we'll give you a car, all you gotta do is work for us and write code, and as long as your code gets us X number of bots per month and we get access to the systems we want, life is good and you continue on. You screw up and your code doesn't work anymore, we just put a bullet in your head and put a new kid in place, and life goes on. And I mean, it works great for the Russian criminal. Yeah, it works great for the Russian criminal mafia and the Sinaloa cartel and some of the other drug cartels have figured out why risk trying to move mountains of cocaine or whatever across the border when there's extradition and all the other stuff, when they can just do cybercrime, make just as much money, and there's almost zero chance they'll ever get caught. So we're starting to see the emergence of more folks that used to do traditional crime showing up in cybercrime.
Question about darknet. I've only heard about darknet in the past 5 days. It's not something I knew about. But what is happening right now as far as, like, everybody knows about the internet. There's some middle ground, and then there's another darknet. What I learned is that there's like the internet, and then there's this middle ground level, and then there's the darknet, which is like the worst one. But what are we supposed to do about protecting? Well, if everything can be accessed, so we have to continue to do business. We have to continue to live in this kind of uncertain world. But I mean, I guess it's just awareness and.
Yeah, I mean, so the darknet, if you will, is really the internet set up for people doing things that they probably shouldn't be doing on the regular internet. They're doing it in ways that make it very hard for them to get caught. In order to get into that, you've got to know the right technologies to use. You've got to know the right way to access it. Once you even get there, it's really nothing more than just a fabric that makes it work. You've actually got to have credentials and accesses and relationships to get access to the forum so that you can actually buy and sell and trade and steal and whatever else. It's a very involved process, and it's not something that the average person really needs to even worry about. It's there. It's kind of like right now, yes, there are, people selling illegal guns all over the U.S., and we know it, and it's a problem, but there's nothing you can really do about it other than just, continue about your daily life and try and do the right things, and, don't go places where you shouldn't, and hopefully, things will be okay. But, yeah, there are some really nasty things going on underground and whatnot, but for the majority of individuals, it's not going to be a problem. The only caution I might say is be careful who you tick off in cyberspace, because if you poke the wrong bear, it can come back and bite you really, really painfully. So if your company's doing X and Y and Z, there's, and it's politically charged or something along those lines, you have to be careful who you side with, because you can pick a battle with someone that you don't want to pick a battle with, i.e. Anonymous, LulzSec, one of those groups. And I honestly am very shocked that this year, with being an election year, that we haven't seen Anonymous or LulzSec or any of those groups going after the candidates. If you think about it, there hasn't been anything in the news about any of those candidates being cyber attacked all year long. Chase Cunningham thinks it's going to happen in November when the elections actually start. But, that type of thing can go bad really quick if you happen to pick the wrong battle.
Just a good example of that is the Cayman Islands turtle farm recently was hit by one of the protection for animal rights groups, and they called me up, and they were under the middle of a spam attack. So it was a very elementary way, but they literally wanted to just take down and blow up the server of the Cayman Islands turtle farm to prove their point. If they couldn't get them in the in the press or otherwise. They were just going to go and do a DDoS attack and basically just try and take them offline. So even the turtles of the world weren't safe from hacking. So.
That's low.
Political system is vulnerable to bogus posts, bogus tweets, and all sorts of things, because so much of what's going on in the political world is being done through unconventional advertising and communication. So what's the way of figuring out the integrity of that, anything you get?
Well, it's dealing with politicians, so the integrity is almost zero anyway, right? So, but, I mean, there's.
Really kill somebody on the other side if you a bogus tweet or whatever.
Yeah, I'm amazed that it hasn't happened more this year. And I personally think that in October, November timeframe, we're going to see attacks just blow up on the election stuff. You know, honestly, I feel bad for some of the folks that are running for office because they're going to get smashed. And I
think
won't lose
some-
any sleep over it, but
I think you've done a great job, Chase. People might actually have a drink with you tonight.
probably not. But
Yeah. No, on that note, I think
yeah, we're running.
Yeah.
wrap up.
Yeah. Thanks very
Cocktail
much.
hour. Thank you.